All right, diving right in to the deep dive. You guys are looking to seriously boost your communication skills, and you sent us a ton of material on that, a whole episode, in fact. So we're going to pull out 15 tips to make you a communication powerhouse, ready to become a master communicator.
Well, communication is the bedrock of pretty much everything, right? Our relationships, our careers, even how we understand ourselves. And these tips offer a real practical toolkit for connecting, understanding, and being heard.
The first tip is about active listening. Now, that might sound super basic, but this episode really dives into how it's way more than just hearing words. It's about really absorbing what's being said, like mining for gold.
Yeah, what's cool about active listening is silencing that inner voice that always wants to jump in with a response. Instead, you're tuning in fully to the other person. Putting your phone down, making eye contact, and offering verbal cues are all part of that.
One technique I found interesting is paraphrasing, putting what you heard into your own words. That really shows a deeper level of understanding, right?
Yeah.
More than just nodding along.
Totally. Paraphrasing is simple, but it's powerful. It makes sure you're both on the same page and shows you're not just hearing, but actually processing the info.
Now, building on that, the episode talks about the importance of empathy. And what stuck with me is that it's not just understanding what someone's saying, but actually feeling what they're feeling. It's like stepping into their shoes, seeing the world from their perspective.
It's a subtle shift, but it makes a huge difference. Imagine a colleague is sharing, some struggles they're having. Instead of instantly offering solutions, try saying, "That sounds really challenging." It shows you're not just listening, but feeling with them.
That makes a lot of sense. Sometimes just knowing someone gets what you're going through is more valuable than any advice. This episode really emphasized that connection.
Next, we're diving into nonverbal communication. We often forget how much we communicate without even saying a word. Our posture, gestures, expressions, they all speak volumes.
It's like our bodies are having their own conversation, right, alongside our words. And I can see how a mismatch between the two could send mixed signals, even if your words are perfect.
Exactly. Like if you're saying, "I'm confident," but your posture is closed off, that creates confusion. So practice open posture, use hand gestures mindfully, and make sure your tone matches your intent.
Yeah, even a genuine smile can work wonders. Sometimes the simplest things have the biggest impact. Now, moving on, the episode suggests we focus on vocabulary expansion. But this isn't about cramming your brain with every word in the dictionary, right?
No, not at all. It's more about having the right words at your fingertips to express yourself clearly and with power. The episode suggests reading widely, anything from novels to scientific articles, and then jotting down any new words in a journal.
It's like building your own word arsenal, ready to use in any situation. I love that image.
And doing this over time can really enrich your communication.
Now let's talk about clarity and conciseness. I think we all struggle with this sometimes, especially in our fast-paced world. Nobody wants to wade through a ton of details to get to the point.
Right. It's about recognizing that everyone's time is precious. Being clear and concise is showing respect. Respect for your audience's time.
So it's about identifying that key takeaway you want your listener to grasp, and then building your communication around that. Using clear language and avoiding, filler words plays a big role too.
You got it. Think of it as laser focusing your message. Cut through the noise and make sure it hits the mark.
Okay, let's talk about emotional intelligence, often called EI. This episode emphasizes how crucial EI is for handling those tricky conversations, with grace and understanding.
It's about recognizing and managing not only your own emotions, but also the emotions of others. It sounds complex, but think of it like tuning into the emotional undercurrents of any interaction.
So if you sense someone's getting upset, you adjust your style to de-escalate the situation. Makes sense.
That's right. That ability to respond to those nuances is a game changer for building stronger relationships and resolving conflicts constructively.
Moving on to tip number 7, open-ended questions. This one resonated with me because I'm always looking for ways to unlock deeper conversations, to really understand someone's perspective.
Yeah. It's about moving beyond simple yes or no questions. Instead of asking, "Did you like the event?" try, "What were your thoughts on the event?" You'll be surprised at the depth of the responses you get.
It's like you're opening a door, right, to a whole new world of understanding, rather than just peeking through a keyhole.
That's a great way to put it. Open-ended questions are powerful for understanding and making stronger connections.
Next, we have reading. I'll admit, at first glance, this one seemed a little out of place, but the episode makes a case for how reading can be a secret weapon for becoming a better communicator. Interesting.
Yeah, reading exposes you to a ton of different writing styles and expands your vocabulary. But here's the surprising part. It also enhances your empathy. When you immerse yourself in a story, you're basically stepping into the shoes of different characters, seeing the world through their eyes.
So it's like a workout for your communication muscles, constantly absorbing new words and ideas and perspectives, which then naturally influences how you express yourself.
Exactly. And the best part is, reading is enjoyable. You can relax, get lost in a story, and develop your communication skills without even realizing it.
Now, this next one might feel a little daunting for some. Public speaking. This episode acknowledges the fear factor, but it also emphasizes just how valuable this skill is to develop.
You don't have to, jump into giving a keynote address right away. Start small. Speak up more in meetings, volunteer to present at a small gathering, or even practice in front of a mirror. Every little bit helps.
The episode also mentioned organizations like Toastmasters, where you can practice public speaking in a supportive environment and get constructive feedback. That sounds less intimidating for sure.
The key is to push yourself outside your comfort zone, but gradually. The more you practice, the more confident and effective you'll become.
Okay, let's shift gears and talk about technology. So much communication now happens through screens. This episode reminds us to be mindful of how we use technology to connect.
Right. It's easy to get careless with our communication online because, we don't have those nonverbal cues to guide us. Our tone, or clarity can be misconstrued in text messages and emails.
Oh yeah, I've definitely been there. A misplaced emoji or lack of exclamation points can totally change the meaning of a message.
And let's not forget about video calls. They become so important. To make those connections more personal, try to maintain eye contact with the camera. It shows you're engaged even though you're not physically there.
That's a good point. It's easy to get distracted by other things on your screen during a video call. But making that eye contact, it really does make it better.
Yeah. It's all about bridging that digital divide and making sure our communication stays effective and engaging, even in virtual settings.
All right, moving on to tip number 11, we're exploring accepting feedback. It's easy to get defensive when someone criticizes us, but this episode wants us to view feedback, even the tough kind, as a gift.
It's a change in perspective, right? If we can see feedback as a chance to grow, it becomes much easier to accept it and learn from it.
The episode also wants us to approach feedback with an open mind and ask clarifying questions if we need to, and even to actively seek out feedback from trusted sources, which can be scary, but helpful.
Absolutely. Being open to feedback and willing to learn from it is a sign of a strong communicator. It shows commitment to getting better.
Next up, we have a skill that often gets overlooked: patience. In our rush to get things done, we forget that effective communication takes time, especially with complex topics.
It's about resisting that urge to interrupt and giving others the space to fully express themselves, even if it takes a little longer than we'd like.
This episode really highlights how patience builds trust and ensures everyone feels heard and respected, which are super important for good communication.
Patience helps create a space where communication can unfold naturally, authentically.
Okay, let's move on to storytelling. Now, I'll be honest, when I first saw this one, I wasn't sure how it fit in, but the episode makes a good case for how powerful storytelling can be as a communication tool.
Stories are great at captivating our attention and drawing us in emotionally in a way that just straight facts often can't. A well-told story makes your message stick.
The episode encourages us to think of our stories as having a clear beginning, middle, and end, which makes sense. It also highlights using vivid details and evoking emotions to make those stories really come alive.
But remember, the story always has to be relevant to your overall message. It's not just about entertainment. It's about using narrative to make your point, to make it impactful and engaging.
This next tip highlights the two-way nature of communication: adapting to your audience. It's about tailoring your communication style based on who you're talking to.
We're all different. We have different levels of understanding and experience. What works for one person might not work for another. We need to be sensitive to cues like body language and adjust our tone and language and delivery accordingly.
It's like speaking different languages, even when you're using the same words. I see how mastering this skill would be a game changer for connecting with a wider range of people.
Yeah, the ability to seamlessly adapt to different audiences is the sign of a really skilled communicator.
And finally, tip number 15. Approaching communication with a positive and open-minded attitude. The episode talks about how positivity is contagious, and it creates an environment for open communication to thrive.
It's so easy to get caught up in negativity, especially during disagreements. But focusing on finding common ground, even when you disagree, can really help.
It's about assuming good intentions, right? And approaching conversations with a collaborative mindset. Makes sense.
A positive and open-minded attitude helps create more respectful dialogue. More constructive, too.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, but there's so much more to explore.
We've only scratched the surface of this. It's fascinating.
I'm excited to dive deeper. Where do we go from here?
You know, as we've been going through these tips, I'm struck by how they all connect. It's like they're not just individual skills, more like pieces of a larger puzzle, the communication puzzle.
That's a great point. It is like they all work together. Active listening and empathy, for example. You can't really empathize with someone if you aren't actively listening to them, right?
Exactly. And emotional intelligence is like the key that unlocks both. It helps us hear the words, but also understand the emotions behind them.
It is fascinating how these seemingly separate skills all work together to create this, like, tapestry of effective communication. Then you add in things like clarity, conciseness, and adapting to your audience. It all starts to feel like a superpower.
I wouldn't disagree with that. But it's important to remember that communication is both an art and a science. There are these fundamental principles we can learn, but there's also that intuition and creativity that come into play.
That's so true. It's not just about following a formula. It's about being present, reading the room, and adjusting your approach as needed. There's always something new to learn and ways to refine our approach.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's take these tips out of the theoretical and into the real world. Imagine you're in a meeting and a disagreement starts to brew. How can these skills help?
Oh, that's a good one. Those tense moments can really test your communication skills. I imagine active listening becomes super important in those situations, making sure everyone feels heard, even if they disagree.
You're absolutely right. And even if you passionately disagree, resist that urge to interrupt. Allowing someone to fully explain their viewpoint, even if you don't agree with it, can go a long way toward de-escalating things.
That makes me think about patience, too, creating that space for everyone to speak their mind without feeling rushed.
And don't forget about empathy. Trying to see the situation from their perspective helps create a more collaborative atmosphere.
I've always found open-ended questions really helpful in those situations. Instead of asking closed questions, which can sound confrontational, you could ask something like, what led you to that conclusion? Or can you help me understand your perspective on this?
Exactly. Open-ended questions shift the dynamic from a debate to a dialogue. They encourage a much more nuanced and productive conversation.
And of course, emotional intelligence plays a huge role. Being aware of your own emotional state and the emotions of others can help you respond in a way that's calm and respectful, even when things get heated.
Yeah, it's about staying composed and remembering that the goal is to find a solution, not to win the argument. And clear and concise language is important too, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Avoiding jargon or overly complicated explanations helps prevent further misunderstandings. Sometimes, keeping things simple is best, especially when emotions are running high.
I couldn't agree more. It helps keep everyone on the same page and focused on finding a resolution.
Okay, so we've talked about conflict. What about giving a presentation? How can these tips help us deliver a presentation that's both compelling and engaging?
Well, storytelling is great for presentations. Weaving in relevant anecdotes can capture your audience's attention and make your message memorable.
I've always admired those speakers who can tell a good story. It's like they can draw you in and make you feel part of the experience. It's amazing.
That's the power of storytelling. But remember, the stories you choose should always reinforce your key points and make them relatable. Make them stick with the audience.
Now, what about nonverbal communication during a presentation? I imagine that's a big factor too.
It definitely is. Your body language is another way to communicate. Eye contact, hand gestures, confident posture, they all help to enhance your message and connect with your audience.
That makes a lot of sense. It creates a more dynamic presentation. Instead of just standing there reading slides, you're using your whole body to bring your ideas to life.
Exactly. And don't forget about adapting to your audience. Who are you speaking to? What are they interested in? What are their needs? Answering these questions will help your presentation be more impactful.
It's like you're creating a conversation, not a lecture, right? You're meeting the audience where they are and inviting them to join you.
I like that. It's about creating a shared experience, one that resonates with your listeners and makes a real impact.
You know, it seems like storytelling is often overlooked as a communication tool, but it's so powerful, not just for presentations, but even for everyday conversations.
Oh, for sure. Stories have this incredible ability to connect us and make ideas come alive.
It's like that saying, facts tell, but stories sell. A good story can make even the most boring information captivating.
That's right. It's about using the power of narrative. It helps build trust and create a deeper connection.
Okay, let's shift gears for a minute and talk about the digital landscape, where so much of our communication happens now. How do these tips apply online, especially since we often don't have those nonverbal cues?
That's a great question. Many of the principles apply, but online communication has its own challenges.
Like, how do you convey tone and nuance in a text message? It's so easy for things to get misinterpreted. I know I've had some awkward moments because of a poorly worded email.
I think we all have. Be extra careful with things like humor and sarcasm, which often don't translate well in writing. And emojis can help, but use them carefully. They can add some emotion to your messages.
That's true. A well-placed emoji can make a huge difference.
Definitely. But don't overdo it. Too many emojis can muddle your message.
Good point. Now, what about video calls? How can we make those virtual interactions as engaging as possible?
Try to maintain eye contact with the camera. I know it feels a little strange, but it creates a stronger connection, even though you're not in the same room.
That's true. I'll admit I sometimes get distracted by other things on my screen during video calls. But you're right, making that eye contact makes a difference.
It really does. It's a way to bridge that digital gap and create a more personal connection.
What about social media? It feels like a whole other world of communication these days.
It really is. Social media has its own unique set of rules and challenges. But many of the principles we've been talking about apply. Things like being mindful of your tone and adapting your message to the platform and your audience are important.
It's a good reminder that even though it feels casual, anything you post online is public. Your words could potentially reach a huge audience.
Exactly. And that underscores the importance of being intentional and thoughtful with what we share online.
And of course, the importance of accepting feedback gracefully, even if it's negative. That's part of being online, right? Where everyone has a voice and an opinion.
That's right. Feedback, both positive and negative, is an opportunity for growth. It helps us to refine our communication style and connect better with others.
You know, we talked earlier about the internal aspect of communication. I think we need to circle back to that.
Yes. Self-talk, often neglected, but so important.
I think this is a fascinating topic for everyone. The way we communicate with ourselves affects our confidence and our mindset. Ultimately, it affects how we communicate with everyone else.
It all starts with that inner voice. If we're always putting ourselves down or being negative, it erodes our self-esteem and makes it harder to communicate confidently with others.
I know. I can be so hard on myself sometimes. But this episode has made me realize how important it is to be mindful of my self-talk and to be kinder to myself.
That's great. It's a powerful realization. We are our own first and most important audience.
I love that. We're constantly giving ourselves this running commentary on our lives, and the tone of that commentary really matters.
Absolutely. It shapes how we see the world and ourselves, and it affects the choices we make.
So how do we start applying these communication principles to how we talk to ourselves? How can we be more mindful and intentional? This feels like a whole other deep dive waiting to happen.
You know, you're right. It's a complex topic that deserves its own exploration.
I couldn't agree more. I can't wait to dive in. You know, this really does feel like a whole new deep dive. We get so focused on how we communicate with other people. But how often do we stop and think about how we're communicating with ourselves?
Right. It's like we have this board meeting happening in our heads all the time, and sometimes that boardroom gets a little out of control.
I love that visual. Sometimes it feels more like an interrogation than a brainstorming session.
Exactly. We can be so incredibly hard on ourselves, especially when we're stressed or feeling the pressure.
So how do we even begin to change that? How do we start talking to ourselves with more compassion, more support?
Awareness is key. We need to start paying attention to that inner voice. What kind of language are we using? Are we being encouraging, or are we putting ourselves down?
It's like we need to become better listeners to our own thoughts. Instead of tuning that inner voice out, we should listen to it like we'd listen to a friend who's confiding in us. Really pay attention.
That's a great point. And once we're paying attention, we can start to challenge those negative thoughts, those limiting beliefs. You know, just like we'd offer a different perspective to a friend who's struggling with self-doubt, we can do the same for ourselves.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like we need to cultivate our inner cheerleader, not the inner critic.
Right. And self-empathy is important here too. We need to acknowledge our emotions without judgment, just like we would with a friend.
So instead of beating ourselves up for feeling a certain way, we can just notice those feelings, offer ourselves some compassion. It's like saying, hey, it's okay to feel this way. Everyone has these ups and downs.
Exactly. We're all human, right? experiencing all those emotions is part of what makes us who we are.
That's a good point. We forget to give ourselves grace sometimes. Earlier we talked about open-ended questions, how helpful they can be in conversations. Do you think those can be helpful in our self-talk as well?
I think they're crucial, actually. Instead of getting stuck in that loop of, why am I so bad at this? We can ask ourselves questions that open up new possibilities, like what can I learn from this? Or what can I do to improve?
That's a much better way to look at it. Those kinds of questions shift the focus from self-criticism to growth, to problem solving. Like you said before, it turns that board meeting into something much more productive.
Right. It's about finding solutions and moving forward, not dwelling on the problem. What about clarity and conciseness? Do you think we can apply those principles to our inner dialogue as well?
I've been thinking about that. My thoughts can get so jumbled, all these worries and doubts. How can we bring more clarity to all that mental chatter?
Well, sometimes it helps to untangle those thoughts and express them more clearly, more concisely. If you can really pin down the core issue, you can start to address it more effectively.
It's like decluttering your mind, right? Instead of a million anxieties, you focus on the one or two things that are really bothering you. That feels a lot more manageable.
It is. And don't forget about storytelling. Sometimes it helps to think of our experiences as stories, highlighting what we've learned, the growth we've experienced, even in the middle of challenges.
I like that. It's like taking a step back and seeing our lives as a narrative. Those setbacks and struggles are just part of a bigger story, a story of growth and transformation. We're the heroes of our own stories, even if it doesn't always feel like it.
Exactly. And remembering that can help us be more resilient, more optimistic too. It's not about ignoring the hard stuff. It's about understanding it's all part of a bigger picture.
Okay, so let's talk about staying positive, keeping an open mind when it comes to our self-talk. We talked earlier about how positivity can be infectious with other people. I bet it has an even bigger impact on how we see ourselves, don't you think?
It absolutely does. If we're constantly being negative and doubting ourselves, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if we can shift toward a more positive inner voice, it can be so empowering. It can help us achieve our goals and live a better life.
It's about believing in ourselves, even when things are tough, and remembering that we're all works in progress.
That's right. It's about embracing the journey, celebrating our progress. And treating ourselves with kindness, the same kindness we'd show a friend.
This has been such an amazing conversation. We've talked about so many great strategies for becoming better communicators in all areas of our lives.
I agree. It's been a real pleasure.
So what's the one thing you hope people will take away from our deep dive today?
I think the most important thing to remember is that communication is a skill. It can be learned and practiced and improved. And that goes for how we communicate with others, but also how we communicate with ourselves. Maybe even more importantly.
That's a great way to put it. It's so empowering to know that we have the power to change how we communicate. And in doing so, change our experiences and our relationships. So listener, as you go about your day, remember to listen to yourself, be kind to yourself, and approach every interaction, both with yourself and others, as a chance to grow and connect.
Beautifully said. And remember, this journey of mastering communication, it never really ends. There's always something new to discover.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today on this deep dive into the world of communication. We hope you enjoyed it.
Until next time.